we've invited the community here to this meeting this evening, really because of the major change in how public schools are financed, and to talk about the potential impact that this legislation will have on the sustainability of our programs in the years ahead. I'm sure you all are aware that there now is a tax cap on all local governments, including school districts. While we are certainly aware that limiting the growth of property taxes has been met with much popular support, after all, who doesn't want to pay less taxes, it is really the unintended consequences that we must consider. And limiting our ability to raise revenue that we need to operate our schools must be offset by reducing our expenditures accordingly. This means difficult choices, and we turn to you to help us to establish our educational priorities in light of these reduced resources. As mentioned, this is the first year of the tax cap, and under the provisions of the law, the school district can levy a tax increase no more than the lesser of 2% of the previous year's levy, or the CPI, whichever is less. Now, this year, where the CPI is 3.2%, so it will allow us to increase our tax levy by 2% plus something called the growth factor, which I'm going to explain shortly. If the tax cap were in place last year, the CPI was under 2%, we would have been limited to an increase of 1.6%. All right, let's take a look at the numbers. The tax levy for this year, 2011-12, is $54,091,985. This is based on the budget that was approved last May. And of that 54 million, 41.7 million was carried by the Huntington town residents of our school district, and 12.3 million was paid for by the Oyster Bay town residents. And each year we go through what percentage, or how do we apportion the tax levy between the two towns, and I'm just going to touch on that briefly later on. Under the current legislation, we can raise taxes, now I'm talking about the 2012-2013 school year, by about $1.5 million. This is more than the 2% because we've been notified just a few days ago by the New York State Office of Taxation that we can apply a 0.8% increase due to a change that they anticipate in the value or in the assessed value of our homes, which increases the tax base. This growth factor is relatively large when compared to other districts, but it will change every year. So it looks like this year we're getting a little bit of a break that we do have this growth factor. So we can also increase our allowable tax levy, how much we can raise in taxes, by some of the excess costs that we might incur for our retirement contributions for some of our employees, but that amount is really not very significant. What this all means is that going into the 2012-2013 school year, we can actually increase our tax levy by about 2.8%, which is more than the 2% that you've been reading. And again, I have to emphasize that the 0.8% part of this equation is something that's going to change every year. And in looking at other school districts, and even throughout the state, the 0.8 is one of the highest increases of most school districts. So in that sense, we seem to be doing quite well. Now, there's something in the law called an override provision. And what that means is that a school district can exceed that tax levy limit if 60% of the people voting, not 60% of the eligible voters, but 60% of those people voting approve the proposed tax levy that would exceed allowable 2%. In this case, the voter referendum must clearly state that the proposed budget tax levy exceeds the allowable 2% limit, and that passage of the budget requires a 60% majority. So if the Board of Education decides that they want to increase the tax levy more than the allowable limit, it must clearly state that in the proposition when the voters go in to vote on the budget. However, once the district decides to override the tax cap and present the vote to the public on those terms, it fails if it does not achieve that 60% approval rate, even if more than 50% and less than the required 60% vote yes. So if you decide you want to exceed the tax cap, and the term that they're using is piercing the tax cap, once you make that decision, you have to get 60%. So if you get 58 or 59%, the budget fails. But you have to make that decision up front. Later on this evening, we're going to ask for your opinion about this override option and under what circumstances you would consider it for our community. So what happens if the budget is defeated? As in the current law, the school district may submit a vote twice to the public. If the budget is defeated on the first vote, or we fail to get the 60%, if that's the decision that we've made, the board can just adopt a contingent budget with no increase in the tax levy, not 2%, but it would have to be 0%. Or the board may present a second vote to the community with the same or revised levy increase. If the budget is defeated a second time, then the board must adopt what's called a contingent budget with no increase in the tax levy. So there would be 0. Under the old law, if you were on a contingent budget, you could increase the tax levy or the budget by 4%. But now with the tax cap, the contingent budget is now 0. So we would have to operate on the same tax levy from the previous year. As I said earlier, the 2% cap certainly has received a lot of popular support because, quite frankly, taxes are very high and people are seeking relief. Also, for many people who believe that school spending is excessive, and you just have to read Newsday to form that opinion, they welcome any law that limits our spending. But the problem is education, especially on Long Island, is expensive, and that is the price we pay, not just here in Cold Spring Harbor, but throughout Long Island, to have quality schools and an excellent teaching staff. But our community does have the right to expect our schools to live within the 2% spending limit. Certainly, this is not unreasonable. If we took away, which we can, the mandated increases in employee pension costs, health insurance premiums, or contractual obligations, our schools would have operated well under the 2% threshold for the past several years. For example, our pension costs in the current budget are up almost $1 million, and our health insurance premiums increased by $500,000. These two items alone would have exceeded the 2% cap if the law were in place last year. Fortunately, the pension and health insurance costs for next year, and this is the budget we're working on now, are going to be far more manageable, and we may get some relief as we continue developing our 2012-13 budget. Last year, when our legislators were promoting the tax cap, they promised us mandate relief. But we have only seen the cap and little relief for the mandates, such as the Triborough law, which requires school districts to continue paying step and longevity increases on expired contracts. That legal mandate alone will cost us about $450,000 next year. Other costly mandates include the Wicks law, which increases the cost of our capital projects by requiring us to hire many different contractors and not a general contractor for construction projects. We have non-public school expenditures for private school transportation, which alone is almost $1 million. private school textbooks and health services. Next year, we're looking at new testing requirements for teacher evaluations and expansive auditing requirements. The tax cap is a reality that will be with us in the foreseeable future, and because of that, we must change the way we develop our budgets in the years to come. The amount of school spending will no longer be determined by our educational needs or initiatives and ability to pay, but rather by the limitations imposed by law. School districts will lose local control, regardless of their means, and public support to expand programs or maintain small class sizes unless the tax cap is overridden. Essentially, the level of funding will be determined by only 40% of those people who vote. Now, we cannot predict where we will be financially in the coming years, but if we had a tax cap 6 years ago, our budgets today would be $8.6 million less, and that represents the base salaries of about 80 teachers, or 45% of our teaching staff. So we must make the difficult choices and cannot rely on our legislators to provide us with mandate relief or the additional funding we need to offset our ability to raise the revenue we need to operate our schools. And that really brings us to the purpose of tonight's meeting, is to hear from our community members in order to assist us in establishing our educational priorities. There'll be 3 questions tonight. If the Board of Education has to make these reductions, which programs and services do you believe are the most important to preserve? We have provided a list of some of these notable discretionary programs at each table. Most of the costs associated, second question, most of the costs associated with extracurricular activities and interscholastic athletics are stipends paid to advisors and coaches. And we have provided you with some of the cost breakdown for those items. As indicated earlier, the Board of Education can offer a budget that exceeds 2% of the allowable tax levy with a 60% supermajority. The risk is that failure to achieve that 60% will result in a defeated budget. A twice defeated budget would mean no increase in the tax levy allowed and dire consequences for the sustainability of our programs. On that third question, here's just some information, a little history on our voting, and hopefully when you have your discussions, you'll reflect on our voting history. And over the last 6 years, we have achieved a 60% majority twice, but 4 times out of 6 we didn't. And you can see the chart there. This last vote, 2011-12, we got tremendous support from our community with a 63% yes vote, with a tax levy slightly under 4%. So those are the, just to give you some idea. One thing before we start this evening, I just want to talk a little bit about the tax levy versus the tax rate. And I think it's important for the community to know, because we always get questions on this, especially when you get your tax bill and the percent that your taxes are going up may be higher than what we published in our brochure. At the time we go out with our budget and we present our brochure to the community and we talk about the taxes, we can only talk about the tax levy, because at that point there are a lot of things we don't know, which determines the actual rate increase. There are other factors that impact the levy that could impact how much your individual taxes go up. And the tax cap that we're talking about applies to the levy. That's how much money the school district can raise in taxes. That's the tax levy. What you pay is based on circumstances that deal with the value of the assessed value of your property. All things being equal, however, the lower the tax levy, the lower the tax rate. But that may not necessarily be the same. And let me just, there are really three things that affect the tax rate. So for example, if our tax levy is going up 2.8% and you get your bill and it says your tax is going up 3.1%, there are other factors that may change that. And the big thing is that if there's a drop in assessments, what that means is that the tax base actually decreases. And one of the reasons that you can see the tax base decrease is when people challenge their assessments and the determination is made that their assessments are too high, so their taxes drop, but that drop has to be shared and picked up by the rest of the people. So, and we've seen some drop in assessments over the last couple of years. All things being equal, if the assessments dropped to 0.5%, then there would be a comparable 0.5% increase in the tax rate, and vice versa. If the assessments increase by 0.5%, everybody's tax rate would be below the tax levy. We also have a very unique situation in Cold Spring Harbor. The fact that we have two taxing towns, we have Huntington and Oyster Bay, there has to be a determination as to how much share of the tax levy will be borne by both towns. And there is this thing, this number out there, it's called the equalization rate, and it's not set by the school district, but it's set by the New York State Office of Real Property Services. And that equalization rate, it's part of a very complicated formula, but that equalization rate is the biggest variable in determining how much of the taxes will be paid by the Huntington side and how much taxes will be paid by the Oyster Bay side. And we've had great fluctuations over the last 4 or 5 years. But the one thing that we have noticed is that in the long run it seems to even out, but in one year you could have a spike on one side or the other. And also in the last few years we've seen changes in the assessment practices in Nassau County. 2 years ago, Nassau County reduced everyone's assessment by over 10%. Everybody who lived on the Nassau side saw their assessments drop by 10%. Unfortunately for the people in Huntington, it increased their taxes, and that certainly doesn't seem fair that the people in Huntington would pay higher taxes because the assessments dropped in Nassau. But the formulas made Nassau look relatively poorer, so a greater part of the burden was shifted to Huntington. Huntington since has hired a consultant to represent them in Albany to address that problem.